Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. My name is Hilary, and I work for the webinar coordinators, Aggregate Consulting. Tonight, we are joined by Professor Wayne Pitchford to discuss replacement heifer management. So a jam-packed webinar and one that's been asked for quite a while now. Just a bit of housekeeping to get started. This control panel will be at the top right corner of your screen. The red arrow on the left collapses and reinstates the control panel. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. Please type your questions as Wayne goes through the presentation in the box provided, and I will relay them to him at the end of the webinar. For those of you who are joining us for the first time as well, these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website at a later date. To introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Wayne Pitchford is a professor at the University of Adelaide. Wayne works closely with beef and sheep industries in Australia and New Zealand with primary interest in genetics and genomics. Wayne has focused his research on maternal productivity, feed efficiency, and carcass and meat quality. Wayne is the director of the Davies Livestock Research Centre and also owns a farm in partnership with his son in Keith, South Australia, where Wayne joins us from this evening. So if you're there, Wayne, I will just make you the presenter. Yep, just remember to unmute yourself. Sorry, Wayne, you're still on mute. Right, I might be able to get that for you. Hold on.
Thanks, Hilary. You had muted me, so I couldn't unmute it.
Oh, sorry, radio. There you go. You're good to go now.
You can obviously hear me now, which is great. So thank you very much to everyone for joining tonight and listening. I'm not actually coming to you from our farm. We live in the Adelaide Hills. The farm is at Keith. We've been hanging out for some decent rain to get the season started, and I'm very pleased to report that in the last 24 hours we've had just about an inch of rain. So things had germinated, but that was real godsend. So I'm going to talk about heifer and cow management, and I should start by saying that I will cover a bit of management and growth and development a lot, and I'll cover some genetics. What I'm not going to cover is a health management program, so I encourage you to work with your local veterinarian to develop a animal health plan for your herd, and I'm really not going to cover that area. What I am going to cover, though, or touch on, is some results from 3 different projects. One run by the Beef Cooperative Research Centre, or the CRC for Beef Genetic Technologies. One that was run with the Hereford Association, which we refer to as the Black Baldy trial, and one current trial which we sort of refer to as the heifer development trial, but it's much more than heifers because it follows commercial cattle through until they wean their second calf. So I'll be touching on all of those. Something we've done recently is just think about how valuable it is to get heifers in calf. And while we're in a herd rebuilding phase, the premiums for being pregnant are quite substantial. And so this is hopefully quite a simple graph where along the horizontal axis, you've got the heifer pregnancy rate, or pregnancy tested in calf rate. If there are 100% of them in calf, and there's a, I'll take the middle number, shall I, the orange line, if there's a 40% premium for being in calf, for being pregnant, then there's a 40% premium across the herd. So the premium that you actually get across your heifer drop or across the heifers that you actually sell, as opposed to those that you retain, the premium that you get depends on how big the premium is and how many of those are pregnant. Now, at the moment, a 60% premium is not conservative. It's quite realistic. Sometimes there's more of a premium than that being paid. And so that green line's quite steep. And so the value of getting cull heifers or heifers that are not required for replacements in your own herd, the value of getting them in calf is quite substantial in terms of providing premiums. And so that sort of indicates that heifer pregnancy rate is a significant driver, at least at the moment. We then did some modelling across the whole herd and looked at across a herd structure what's the sort of gross margins or EBIT, earnings before interest and tax, if you had two different heifer pregnancy rates, 90% and 70%, and two different rebreed rates. So of the ones that are calved as heifers or as first calvers, as maidens, what percentage of them got back in calf? And so that's what we here are calling the rebreed rate. And the darker green is the 90% rebreed rate, and the lighter green is the 70% rebreed rate. And across this herd, this is a herd that we modelled. It's not a real herd, but modelled with current prices and likely age structure across the herd. And to me, what it shows is a big difference. In fact, more than $100,000 difference between the herd with a pregnancy rate of 90% in the heifers versus one with 70% in the heifers. And yet, so between the left and the right-hand columns, a big difference, whereas the rebreed rate is not actually that high. And this is something that's slightly counterintuitive, because a lot of people would say, well, the real crunch point is the rebreed rate, and surely that's the biggest profit driver. I think here what's going on is that because the animals are still growing, then if they're not in calf for rebreeding, then they still have significant cull cow value, and cull cow prices are reasonably high, and so they add to the price of animals sold, or the total amount of beef that's sold off the farm. I think one of the reasons people think that crunch point is so important is because they've been nurturing the animals all the way through from weaning or from birth even, got them in calf, had a calf, managed to get them through the point where they didn't have to assist a calf, or if they did assist them, they managed to have a successfully raise a calf. And then if you don't get them, after you've done all that effort, if you then don't get them back in calf, it's a real blow. And these figures would suggest that perhaps it's a bigger psychological blow than what it is actually an economic blow. I guess it does depend on the values you put on different animals, and certainly if cull cow prices were low, that would have a different impact on this result. The point, though, the take-home point that leads into the rest of the next section is that getting heifers in calf is really important. So here's some results from our beef CRC work. And on the vertical axis, we've got pregnancy rate. On the horizontal axis, pre-joining weight. And we had heifers, we were buying in heifers for the research herd component, buying in heifers from multiple places. These are Angus heifers. And there would be a bit of variation in age, a bit more variation than you'd see on a normal property. They ranged from 250 to 500 kilos, so a huge range in weight. And the red line shows for those that were a condition score 2.5, what percentage of those got in calf in the first 6 weeks or the first 2 cycles. We actually joined them for 9 weeks, but because we could tell when they calved, we could actually work out what percentage got in calf in the first 6 weeks versus what percentage got in calf in the second or the third cycle. So that the difference between the red line and the blue line is those that got in calf in the third cycle. So those really light ones, only 60% of them got in calf in the first 2 cycles, but then another 20%, bit over 20%, got in calf in that 3rd cycle. So that tells us that pre-joining weight is really important, and it's especially important for getting them in calf quickly. We also looked at fatness, and not surprisingly, the fatter the heifer, the more got in calf. Now, anyone who's had kids that have taken heifers to, let's say, well, an example we've had is they've taken heifers to a heifer show in July, and then they've taken heifers to the Royal Show, the same one, at the start of September, and those heifers hadn't been mated ahead of time, and they've been fed too much for the show, and they can definitely be overcooked, and you end up with fatty udder syndrome and stuff as well, and you can end up with low pregnancy rates if they get fat enough. But in this trial here, there weren't really any heifers that were at that overcooked level. So between sort of 1 and 10 millimeters of rib fat, basically the fatter they were, the more got in calf, and that red line's pretty steep. Showing there that if you go, say, from 5 to 7 millimeters of rib fat, then you're increasing the number they're getting in calf from, what's that, 75 to well over 85%. So more fat is better. And then if you give them an extra 3 weeks, then the curve's still reasonably steep, but there's still the ones that are leaner, there's still some that get in calf at that 3rd cycle. And then how do you get fat onto them? Well, you can feed them more, or you can have some genetic fat in the system, or a combination of both. And then a graph that's trying to demonstrate the combination of both weight and fat. So what I've got here on the vertical axis is the same thing, the pregnancy rate. On the horizontal axis, we've got the pre-joining weight going from 250 to 500 kilos, and then a different line for different fat depths. And so our current thinking is that around about 350 pre-joining weight is a pretty good target. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. If 350 is a good target, then if they're 350 kilos but with very little fat on them, so a real large frame lean type animal, less than 70% could get in calf, whereas if they had lots of fat on them, then you're looking at over 80% of them getting in calf. And that would be in the first 2 cycles. Those lines are for if it was under a 6-week joining. I might just touch on why I said 350. We just, at the moment, our thinking is that, and I'm open to input on this, but our thinking is you're getting pretty good percentages in calf at that rate. But the other thing is that for those that don't get in calf, you're actually growing them to a pretty good level where during joining they'll keep growing. And so by the end of joining, or by the time they're preg tested, they're actually about right for feedlot entry weight. And so there's other market options if they're not actually in calf. Whereas if you're pushing them too hard and they don't gain sufficient during spring, and then you don't have those market options, or you've got to put a lot of feed into them before you get them to to feedlot entry weight, then you can start to really eat into your profits. One of the things that we felt during the CRC was it would be really good to be able to scan these animals for puberty, because we think what's going on is that the fatter ones are reaching puberty earlier. And so when we ran the Black Baldy trial, we decided to actually do some scanning for puberty. And this is just some results from the very first year in the trial. And the animals were, about 25 kilos at weaning. And then we grew them out to sort of almost 300 kilos, and we scanned them, ovarian scan, to see whether they're pubertal or not. And you can see whether they're actually ovulating at the time, but also whether they have previously ovulated. And there was about 10% that were pubertal at that time. And then we scanned them again when they were about 390 days. And they hadn't grown much at all during that time. They were through a fairly harsh winter on that property, and they were stocked fairly heavy. So at about 390 days of age, and another 14% of them had got in calf. And then, so that's a total of 24% up to that point. And then we scanned them pre-joining, and at about 450 days of age, and another 14% had got in, sorry, another 28% had got in calf, 28% had reached puberty. So those numbers there, 10, 14 and 28%. So P1, the blue line, is the weight of the animals that were pubertal at the first scan. The orange line, P2, is the weight of the animals that were pubertal at the second scan. The grey line is those that were pubertal at the third scan, and the yellow line is those that were not pubertal pre-joining. So there's a couple of things to notice there. Not surprisingly, the ones that were not pubertal were slightly younger, and they were lighter as well, and that's why they were not reaching puberty, we guess. But 52% of them pubertal, but almost half of them, 48%, not pubertal going into joining. We thought this was a total disaster, and in fact, later, the following 2 years, the result was even worse than that. One of the years we had only 10% of them pubertal going into mating, and we thought, far out, this is a total disaster. Turns out it's not as bad as we thought. Here's just an additional bit of data just to show on the horizontal axis there the percentage that are pubertal, and on the vertical axis the actual weight. And so it shows the different ages there, and it just shows that the black baldy were just slightly heavier than the purebred Angus, and more of them were pubertal, and that really was a function of them being just in a little bit better condition and a little bit heavier. Anyway, let's get back to the point that I was just alluding to, that almost half of these animals were not pubertal going into mating, and the dogma that we were operating under was that really animals should have cycled a couple of times before joining, so that about the third cycle that is when they're with the bull, and then they're ready to rock and roll. Well, what we found was, of those ones that were pubertal at the first scan, 90% of them got in calf. Of those that were pubertal at the second scan, 89% of them got in calf. Of those that were pubertal at the third scan, 95% of them got in calf. So overall, 92% of those that were pubertal into joining got in calf. That's great. That's kind of what we expect. But of the 48% that weren't pubertal, 85% of them got in calf. And on average, they only calved 9 days later than those on average that were pubertal going into mating. So I've got a conclusion written here. Either our scanning for puberty was completely inaccurate, which I don't think it was. I think it was quite good. Or there was lots of those heifers were actually reaching puberty during joining, and they were actually getting pregnant on their first cycle. Now, these animals were joined in October, and in October you've got days getting longer, you've got the pasture quality still being outstanding, the pasture growth rate being high. So you've got high levels of protein, high levels of energy, and high digestibility, longer days, warmer weather, and you've got the effect of the bull being introduced to the heifers. And all of these things together really brought, it all worked together. So the system actually held up, even though we thought it was going to be a total disaster. So really quite a big challenge to what we thought needed to occur. Now, I'm sure that that would not be a great result if you joined them in winter or in autumn or something like that, but joining at exactly the right time to match pasture supply with the demand of those heifers, the system worked. However, of those that were pubertal, those 52% that were pubertal, 64% of them raised 2 calves. Of those that were not pubertal, only 40% raised 2 calves. So even though lots of them did get in calf, they were later, and more of them were open at the first joint, or did not get back in calf, and so forth. And so it actually shows that it's not essential to be pubertal going into mating, but certainly does help in terms of setting you up for the second joining as well, where if you're a bit later and you're a bit lighter and the system's being pushed that much harder, it's a struggle to get back in calf. I want to show you this graph here. I think this is quite instructive, and I can see there'll be a range of responses to this. But of those heifers that were weaned, let's say that's 100% of them, there are about 5% that weren't joined because they just weren't heavy enough to put with the bull. There were then, of those, there's some that are dropping out all the way through. So, sorry, some that were not ovarian scanned. Of those, then some were not joined. So we're down just below 90% of those that were weaned were actually joined. Of those that then got pregnant, about just under 70% of those that were weaned were actually pregnant at the first preg test. And then it goes down to about, what, 62, 3-4 that actually calved. And then there were some calves that were lost. And so those that were actually lactating, you're at about 52, 53%. And then of those that were actually joined, it goes down again. And then of those that actually got in calf, and there's a slight difference between the Angus, purebred Angus, and the black baldies, the Hereford side animals, of those that were rebred. And then those that actually calved the second time, we're down to flipping 30% of those that were weaned that actually had 2 calves. Now, I'm really pleased I can't hear your response to this graph, because let me just say 2 things. One is, this property, they did run things pretty hard. And so I suspect that the results here are worse than for many properties. However, I also suspect there's a much bigger dropout on lots of properties than what people actually are aware of or give credit to. So I think there's a challenge in here to think about in your own system how many heifers actually drop out at each point of those that were actually weaned. And I bet it's worse than what you realise. But also, I would definitely acknowledge that there's lots of systems that would be not having as high dropout rates as this here. You know, some would say, well, you know, this is just about as low, as poor a dropout rates as northern cattle on tropical pastures. The most recent project we've been doing is not on research herds, and I mean, that Black Baldy project was a commercial herd as well, but we've been going across a whole lot of herds, and we've got a couple of years data now. And what I've got here is 18 mobs of data. Each one of these dots represents a mob, and lots of them, it's just a farm in a given year. Occasionally there's some farms with a couple of different mobs of heifers that have been grown at different rates. And the blue dots, so earlier in the graph, or earlier graphs, I had 2 cycles versus 3 cycles. What I've actually got here is 1 cycle versus 2 cycles. And I've got along the horizontal axis the start of mating weight, the joining weight, and then on the vertical axis the conception rate. What percentage got in calf in either the first cycle or in 2 cycles. So the orange line is in 2 cycles. And usually people would give, you know, at least a couple of cycles to get heifers in calf. So you might be wanting to look more at those orange values than at the blue ones possibly. But these are industry data, good herd, huge range of starting weights, you know, from just under 300 kilos up to almost 440 kilos. You know, none of these seriously crashing, although, you know, there's quite a few orange dots. So even after 2 cycles, quite a few there between 50 and 60% of heifers getting in calf. And if you think about those premiums I showed earlier at the start, then there's some lost opportunity there. Even if they're breeding enough replacements, there's lost opportunity for being able to sell off heifers that are in calf. Here's an example of one of those herds in one particular year, and on the left I've got the body weight of these heifers over time, and on the right we've got body condition score on a 1 to 5 scale, and the different colours show how many those that got in calf early on the first cycle is the blue. Those that got in calf on the second cycle is the purple, and then those that did not get in calf is the yellow line. And hopefully you can see that the yellow line is at the bottom of the weight and the bottom of condition. So not surprisingly, those heifers that were in lower weight and lower condition were less likely to get in calf. The other thing to see here in the horizontal axis is days from joining. So we weighed them pre-joining, we weighed them post-joining. We didn't actually get them on joining day, but day 0 is joining day. But what it shows is that they actually lost weight going into joining or during joining. And that can't be good. That's so different to that herd I showed earlier with the Black Baldy trial, where even though they were pushed really hard because they were joined at exactly the right time, the system still worked. This one's the opposite, where it's actually an autumn calving herd, and they actually lost condition during, or lost weight during joining, and their condition loss was even bigger than their weight loss. This is an example of a herd here that is worth just spending a little bit of a time on. The graphs are sort of the same. The horizontal axis is days from heifer joining. So we weighed them a couple of times, weighed them at weaning and then weighed them pre-joining, and then weighed them in winter and then pre-calving, and then pre-joining for their second joining, and then at preg scanning time for their second calving. Now, this is quite a big property, and they're trying to build up numbers at the moment. So what they joined their heifers for 3 cycles, not 2. And so the blue line is the first cycle, the purple line's the second cycle, red line's the third cycle, yellow's the empty. So the empties were culled. So we haven't got a subsequent weight from those. So that's why that yellow line stops. But what I wanted to show here is, I'm sure you'd be aware that those heifers that are sort of getting in calf in the 3rd cycle, they're really up against it when they come around to their second joining. You know, they've calved later in the season, they're still in negative energy balance by the time the bulls put in, and you know, they're going to be, and they're still growing. Life's really against them, and so getting them back in calf is really hard. What they did on this property is they actually manage the first cycles and the second cycles and the third cycles in 3 different mobs. And they ran the first and second cycles not super hard, but you know, reasonably hard. And with the third cycles, they actually gave them more feed. So over on the right-hand side of the graph at the top, hopefully you can see that the red line was well below the first cycle, at least. Those that got in calf earliest were the heaviest ones early on. But then because they were given more feed, they actually ended up on average heavier than the first and second cycles. And when they did that, what it shows is something that completely passes the test of common sense, and that is that if you give them more feed, they grow heavier, and then when they remated those, because they were actually in better condition, of those 3 groups, they all had 87 to 90% back in calf within 2 cycles. And so it shows that if you've got them coming into the system late, if you actually feed them more, you can bring them up to where the others are, so that then in the mature cow herd, they're then ready to rock and roll as sort of robust mature cows, and away they go, and they can be managed as part of the cow herd from then on. So it's just a really good little case study to show how those 3rd cycles were able to be brought back with the rest of the herd. Okay, so in the BCRC, these are some results that we got, and it shows that for young cows, and we had 2 lines, high and low fat lines. We ran them under 2 different nutrition levels as well. I'm only showing you the low nutrition here because really our low nutrition is closer to what probably industry should be run at, rather than the high nutrition treatment. And it shows that the percentage of those that were actually lactating and pregnant, or what we call wet and pregnant, only about 2/3 of the genetically low fat ones did the job in terms of being lactating and got back in calf. And the ones that were genetically higher fat, then there's about 76 or 77% or something, got in calf, had a calf, were lactating and got back in calf. And so it shows that sort of impact of genetics on the system, where a bit of genetic fatness sort of helped in that situation. But then as mature cows, there's about 88% of them were lactating and getting back in calf. Basically, they're pretty robust and they kept doing this thing, and no real difference between the high and low fat lines. Maybe if you push them much harder, then there would have been. So to us, this showed that sort of the managing those young animals is a really key thing. So one of the messages around cows, and we're doing some modelling on this at the moment just to see what the impact is and would it actually increase farm profitability. But we think around some of the messages around the cows is actually nurture the teenagers and push the old girls a bit harder. And I suspect that in terms of maximising the amount of feed that is converted to weight, or to beef weight, in which we can sell off, pushing cows a bit harder, I suspect, is actually a good thing to increase pasture utilisation. But I think some of the messages I'm hopefully showing tonight, that the value proposition around actually getting some weight and condition into our heifers is pretty good value proposition. And so we might say if you're getting 95% of the cows in calf, then, or your heifers in calf, then run more cows. But if you're only getting 70% of them in calf, then, Houston, we have a problem. You need about 60% of your heifers in calf to provide replacements, but actually being able to sell animals that are in calf adds a premium, as I said at the start. So we reckon differential management of young stock and older stock, young stock being heifers to get them in calf, and then heifers during calving and early on in lactation is probably well worthwhile. And to me, this is a lot like for sheep producers scanning for singles versus twins and giving more feed to those twin-bearing ewes and having more profit from that differential feeding of the twin-bearing ewes relative to the single-bearing ewes. The other thing is that genetics does play a part, and what we've got here is maternal productivity, which is the weight of calf weaned per unit of energy in. And under high nutrition, there wasn't any difference between the high and low fat lines. Under low nutrition, so this is just based around stocking rate, so higher stocking rate, which is what you need to be to increase productivity, having some genetic fatness in the system increased the productivity of the system when it was pushed harder. Now, when it was easy, when things weren't pushed, and that high nutrition one, then genetic fat in the system had no value. When things were pushed more by having higher stocking rate, then a bit of genetic fat was pretty good insurance, is how we often say it. But certainly, the genetics came into play a bit more there. Having said that, the key breeding value to look at maternal productivity in cattle is not fat. It is actually the days to calving estimated breeding value. And so what I've got here on the horizontal axis is the days to calving EBV in the for those heifers that were in the trial, and negative is better here because it's a shorter time from when they're put with the bull to when they get in calf, to when they calve, sorry. And so most of the variation in that is just how fast did they actually get in calf, and then pregnancy rate on the vertical axis. And so under a 6-week joining, that line's fairly steep. So have a better days to calving breeding value, and more of the heifers are going to get in calf. And that 9-week one's not quite as steep, but still, reasonably strong relationship between days to calving breeding value and pregnancy rate. Now, this might sound like I'm giving a slightly different message from the messages around fatness, but the relationship between fatness and days to calving is actually accounted for in the breed plan model. And so the reality is those that have better days to calving breeding values will tend to be your slightly earlier maturing, slightly fatter types of animals. So they're going to be a little bit more robust when they're pushed harder in the system, harder in terms of stocking rate and in terms of pasture utilisation. Okay, I just want to finish with a couple of genetics messages. And I remember an article that Phil Holmes wrote almost 3 years ago in Beef Central. And my take-home message from that is that when you go to choose genetics, and I'm going to focus here on the bulls, selecting bulls for cow traits, but when you go to choose genetics, the biggest decision you make is which driveway you drive down. And, you know, the individual animals that you actually choose are important, but the first biggest decision is actually which driveway do you actually go down. And what we don't want is for you to choose which driveway you go by, which is the best lunch that you get served. We actually want you to focus on going down the best driveway where there's lots of bulls there that are being tested and performance recorded for the right traits and have breeding values available for them. And so some take-home messages with the bulls, and this is bulls to breed cows that are going to be more productive, so it's completely on topic. That is that lots of the genetic progress actually comes from the bull, because you only need one bull to 40 cows or something like that. So there's a lot higher selection intensity. So choose the right driveway, select on a balanced breeding objective. Don't just select animals for high fat or just for days to calving or just for growth or just for muscling or just marbling. Select for a balanced breeding objective. Lots of people don't like selection indexes, but they are the best way, at least as a starting point, to actually guide you across the range of traits. And then within those, check for extreme breeding values that might be a problem. So choose animals that are good on index, but check to see in your system, are there some that are really too lean or really too high birth weights for calving and bad for calving ease or something like that. And then check for visual structural soundness. And focus not only on getting the best bull, but getting the best truckload of bulls. Because while the accuracy of breeding values in individual animals is not great, the accuracy of the average of a team of bulls is very, very good. And so if you can focus on getting the best truckload, that's going to be your best strategy. So with that, Hilary, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Wayne. And some great take-home messages there for the audience to think about when, you know, getting their heifers through their first calving. And then also I like the messages towards the end with the bulls. It's always a good thing to have it front of mind. Just if those who have to head off early before we get into questions, please take the time to do the survey that will be presented to you as you exit the webinar. This survey provides feedback to MLA, the presenters and us, the facilitators, just to make sure the topics are relevant for you as the listeners. All right. Those who do have questions, please send them in ASAP and I will relay them to Wayne. Just I will also mention again, if you do have to head off, these webinars are recorded and will be available on the MLA website, usually by Friday. So the first question, Wayne, has come through from Tony. What are your thoughts on keeping heifers out of heifers?
So that's a good question. I don't have any problem with it as long as you can grow them big enough to have enough frame to then be able to calve, you know, get in calf to start with, and then calve down to you know, without calving difficulty. And I know that's a challenge at times. If you can achieve that, then keeping heifers from heifers is the really great thing to be doing, because then you're turning the generations over faster. And on average, if you keep buying better bulls, or if you buy from studs that are making genetic progress, then even if you keep buying the same level of bulls from them, each year your bulls will be genetically better than the previous year, which means each heifer drop are slightly genetically better. Now, that genetic gain is important, but it's not a huge driver for a commercial beef operation. So the young heifers from heifers are genetically, you know, a sort of a generation and a half ahead of where others are, but at the same time, I think maximising beef production off a certain area of land with past utilisation and other strategies, there's going to be a bigger return on investment in that than solely focusing on turning generations over fast from a commercial point of view. So you just got to be careful not to fall in the trap of pretending you're a stud. Studs need to focus on genetic progress. You need to go to studs who are doing that. but yeah, heifers out of heifers, if you can get enough weight on them, no problem.
Thank you. The next question from Stuart. Do you have any tips on boosting pregnancy rates for heifers in an AI program?
So at least one of our, I think actually a couple of our herds in the data that I presented actually had a single shot of AI. And really there's two keys as far as I can tell. One is getting heifer condition right, which is the same as if they're going to be presented to the bull. So getting, depending on the type of animals as to how much fat they have, but getting the weight and condition onto them. And then for fixed time AI programs, absolutely following the instructions on the exact timing is crucial.
Thank you. The next question from Karina. What age would be the best for joining besides the size?
It's a very good question. And I think what you're asking, well, I hope someone is not asking, should I wait till they're a bit over 2 before I join them? Because I think in Southern Australia, almost always we should be aiming to have them calve at 2. So you should be aiming for a 15-month joining. So hopefully the question is more about, should I actually join them a month younger to be able to give them more chance to get back in calf later? And that really comes down to individual herds and when they're calving relative to their pasture growth. The herd for the Black Baldy trial that I showed, they really struggled to get heifers in calf sort of a month earlier, and they were probably better off just waiting until the time when they would make the rest of their herd and just try and heifers that get back in calf fast, use those as replacements for their herd.
Great, thank you. The next one from Fiona. How important is the gestation length EBV? Does a heifer that has more time between calving and joining have a high rebreed conception rate?
Yeah, so I'll give a general answer there. Having a shorter gestation means that the calf is likely to come out a little bit smaller, therefore reducing calving difficulties, and as well as that, the cow then has just 2 or 3 or 4 days more to recover before they're put with the bull. It's kind of important. I think the calving ease EBV should do the job. They should take account of the correlations between gestation length, birth weight, shape, and calving, the actual calving ease. So I would say focus primarily on the calving ease EBVs. I know there's some concern about them, but they are the best we have. The primary time where it's really good to focus on gestation length EBVs is actually not in beef. It's actually if you are buying bulls to put over dairy cows, where every extra day of milking production is worth quite a lot, and you just want to get a cow pregnant and then get a calf out of it as soon as possible so she can be in milk for longer. In a beef system, the variation that's there, I don't think that they're crucial, but calving is obviously important, especially for heifers, of course.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. The next one from Charles. What effect would hybrid vigour have on conception at different weights, namely lighter, and successful rejoining?
Yeah, good question. In general, the hybrid vigour effect increases appetite. So animals with hybrid vigour will, for the same age, will tend to be a bit bigger and in a bit better condition. And if their heifer's in a bit better condition and a bit bigger, they're more likely to get in calf. And if they've got more condition going into calving and they've eaten a bit more after calving as well, then they're going to be in a bit better condition when you go to rebreed them as well. And that's what that Black Baldy trial results showed, that when on that rebreeding result, the crossbreds were actually significantly better than the purebreds in that rebreed, even though the first breeding there wasn't a significant difference. The rebreeding, it was slightly better. So yeah, hybrid vigor has some advantage. There's nothing special about it. I mean, if there's genetic diseases in the herd, like recessive defects, if they're a crossbred, then they're less likely to be homozygous for those defects, but that's a small part of it. Realistically, just think of them being a bit like me at a buffet. They'll just eat a little bit more than others, and they'll just put on a bit more condition than others because of that.
Rightio, thank you. The next one, there's a few of these, and you did throw out a few numbers, Wayne, but if you could just summarise, what is the ideal weight for joining heifers?
So you just broke up a tiny bit, Hilary. Are you asking the ideal weight for heifer joining?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so I can't give a black and white answer on this because it does depend on the system. I showed the example of the black baldies where they were significantly lighter than the weight that I think people should probably aim for, and the system still worked. Some of our early CRC data suggested that something close to 400 kilos is what people should be aiming for, but I think that in most systems that's too high to be profitable. So we haven't done all the modelling on the current project yet, but my gut feeling is that aiming for about 350 is a good aim.
Excellent, thank you. The next question, if you're on a 6-week joining program for mature cows, is it worth giving heifers 7 weeks to get back into calf after their first calf?
So that's a good question. That as long as they are not going to just fall out of the system the following year, if they've actually got a chance of being able to stay with the rest of the mob, then that'll be fine, and getting them back in calf is a really good thing. So yeah, the only concern would be is if they actually are on their 3rd cycle by the time they do that, and you're just sort of delaying the inevitable, creating a problem for yourself.
Thank you. The next one from Stuart. Does joining heifers on high protein feed reduce pregnancy rates? For example, spring pastures with high clover content?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on this. I think my understanding is that it very well could, and partly that's because if there's really high protein levels, which there can be during joining time, the animals can be effectively on the Atkins diet, where they can become effectively energy deficient because the protein levels are so high, and they're having to excrete such high levels of nitrogen, and the protein energy balance is not right. If they're effectively energy deficient, even though there should be enough energy in the pasture, then physiologically what's presented to the ovary is equivalent to actually losing weight, and they are then, it's going to have a negative impact on whether they ovulate or not, and it's going to have a negative impact on early embryonic survival. So yeah, I'm not an expert in the area, but I could see easily that could cause problems for sure.
That's fine, thank you. Thanks for the question. The next one from Anna, was there any correlation between joining weight and dystocia?
So that's a really good question. We don't actually have great data in our projects on dystocia because we haven't had high levels of dystocia. But talking to veterinary colleagues, the key thing to prevent issues with dystocia is actually the growth during the last trimester. And so joining weight should not have a huge impact on dystocia. It would be more about what's going on with the with that heifer during that last trimester leading up to calving time.
Great, thank you. The next one from Fiona. Would you suggest a higher bull joining percentage when joining heifers compared with cows?
These are great questions. I don't know the answer to that. I think people, if they're using 1:40, would normally get sufficient. One thing people do need to be careful of is if they're using fixed time AI for their first shot of the heifers, which is a good strategy in many ways, then for those that don't get in calf on that first AI shot, there's going to be lots and lots of them that are cycling at the same time and on that second cycle, and you need to have really good bull coverage for that time. I can see scenarios, and we've seen it in our own sheep flock recently, where if you've got shy rams and you've got maiden females, sometimes there needs to be a bit of experience in the system where you can end up with low reproductive rates, but it'd be more about managing the system right and having some mature girls in there perhaps as well or something, rather than having extra bulls necessarily.
Excellent, thank you. There's a few questions here, Wayne, that in the gist of all of them is, could you give an idea of the correct joining length for heifers? Is it 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks? If you could just comment on that, I think you'll cover a fair few of the questions in here.
Yeah, so that's another good question. I'm really enjoying the questions. In many ways there's not clear answers. We work with one herd that only joins their heifers for 3 weeks, and the reason they do that is because they have an off-farm job and they take holidays during heifer calving time, and they don't want that to go on for too long. So for that system it actually works. Other people may want to join their heifers for 9 weeks because the premium for being pregnant is really high. The question then becomes not how long you join your heifers for, but when you preg test them and fetal age them, should you actually be selling off those that are likely to be calving later, and either have someone who buys them have the problem, or someone who buys them may be calving later anyway, and they might be fine for their particular herd.
Great, thank you. Jane said, please take the hamburger off the screen or I will be over my ideal weight very soon. Thank you, Jane. The next one, or the last one that I've got here, unless any come in while we talking about it. Great presentation, thanks, Wayne. The best AI pregnancy results I have heard of were from a farmer who runs his heifers very tough. Our heifers get treated like royalty and we had disappointing results. All cattle similar age, AI time, and our heifers are a lot heavier at the time of AI. Vets can't tell us much. Do you have any idea?
The short answer is no. AI results are highly variable, and some exactly of what's being presented to the ovary in terms of the energy status and hormone status of the animal at the time. We don't understand that fully. There's differences in semen quality. There's differences in getting the timing just right. You do hear lots of results exactly like those we just quoted. I am afraid I can't help with that. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. The next one from Philip. In our use, we use teaser rams. Can you use a teaser bull, and would it be of any advantage?
I haven't actually quantified that. We've looked up a few results. There is evidence of a bull effect, and I reckon in that black baldy trial that it must have been not only the effect of the pasture quality that those heifers started cycling, but actually there must have been a significant bull effect as well. I suspect the answer is yes, that having some bull effect would be helpful. I don't know how big it is, nor whether it's actually worth doing or not.
Great, thank you. And the last one from Mark. Young bulls that have not been used before, have you seen any problems that they aren't going to do the job straight away?
I don't have good data on that either. Just anecdotally hear from people that are just having some males and females in the system with a bit of experience can be helpful to guide people. I often think it's a bit like seeing teenagers at a country dance at a hall when you've got the girls at one end and the boys at the other, and just having a few people to get things going can be quite helpful. That's my analogy.
If you don't mind, Wayne, we just had a few more come in last second. And two of them would just ask you to just touch on treating heifers in the last trimester in terms of mitigating the risk of dystocia.
Yeah, so you've got to have the animals fed so that they're healthy, but you just don't want them to be gaining too much condition in that period, because if they're getting fed enough to gain condition in that last trimester, there's going to be quite a lot of fetal growth, and it's that you then end up with that fetal disproportion between the growth of the calf and of the heifer, and that's just the really big driver of dystocia. I have heard some people say about like the autumn calvers, if there's a really early or rain in summer or something, and there's a bit of green pick around, they get higher protein feed, that they can end up with more problems when it happens like that. I don't know how much the protein energy balance is the issue versus just total energy supply, but just carefully managing that period in terms of keeping the heifers healthy and fed well but not overfed is important. They're fairly grey words, not black and white recommendations, but hopefully people understand what I'm talking about.
Excellent. Thank you, Wayne. That's all we have time for this evening. So thank you, everyone, for sending your questions in. That kept Wayne on his toes. And thank you again, Wayne, for your presentation. And thank you all who attended.
Thanks a lot.